Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Common View podcast. My name is Zach Goodman. I'm going to be your host. And today with us, we have an incredibly special guest, the one, the only, Sam Gale. Sam, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, dude. I was telling you a little bit before we started shooting, but when I was thinking of putting together a podcast and was thinking of prospective guests that I wanted to have, you were one of the ones I wanted to have on because... One, you actually have knowledge of interesting topics, which always helps. It keeps the rambling down to a minimum.
Right.
And secondarily, some of the things that we're going to touch on over this next hour or so are some very, I guess, pertinent issues in America today. So for those who don't know who you are, who are you?
Yeah, so I was born and raised here in Raleigh. Went up to the mountains to do college. I was going for music ed. A couple dumb decisions. I ended up at a private college a little bit north of Asheville, studying for music ed. So it took me about a year and a half before I finally did a little bit of math. And I was like, wait, I'm going to be in debt forever. So I dropped out of that. Me and my fiance decided to move down to the coast to be closer to her family, and it was about February, March of 2018 that I was diagnosed with stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. After that diagnosis, we moved back here to the Triangle just so I could get my treatment at Rex, which has a really great cancer center. About 4 or 5 months into my treatment, I finally had regained my quality of life thanks to the treatment, as well as help from cannabis, CBD, hemp, all the whole range of cannabis products. And I was able to actually get myself a job in the hemp industry that I'd become so passionate about after its help throughout my treatment. And so now I'm an employee at one of the hemp dispensaries here in downtown Raleigh. I'm an advocate both in my personal life and to people I meet out on the street and at work every day, helping to mostly just educate people about the realities of cannabis and hemp and how it can help both patients, recreational users, and the agriculture side of our state.
Man. So, well, first off, I mean, that original diagnosis had to be terrifying because stage 3, you've already gotten into the area. I mean, not to say that there's any cancer that's not kind of hairy.
Right.
But at stage 3, you've gotten into the hairy part of it.
Yeah, definitely. Thankfully, with Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it's definitely a very treatable cancer, but it's once it gets into that stage 3, stage 4 area that it becomes a lot more iffy how things are going to go, just because stage 1, it's only in one area. Stage 2, it's proceeded to multiple organs on one side of the body. And then stage 3, where I was at, it was in both sides of my body. So the only way it would have been worse is if it had made it into the bone marrow, which would have meant I would have had to get a bone marrow transplant alongside the chemotherapy and everything, which would have been way worse because those things suck.
No, I've never experienced it personally, thank goodness, but I have talked to people who have had to go through that. Right. And the pain is apparently excruciating.
Yeah.
No matter what happens. But and you are in full remission, is that correct?
Yes.
Wonderful, dude.
Yeah.
That's got to be, I mean, look, I mean, understand, getting cancer at 21 is probably incredibly scary, but right. The fact that you made it through that is admirable.
Oh, yeah. It was definitely because the doctor that I first saw was just a primary care physician down near Swansboro, North Carolina, which I don't know if you've been to Swansboro. It's not the most...
I have not been to Swansboro.
Not surprising. It's a pretty small little beach town. So I go to the primary care doctor because I've been fainting a couple times recently. And so they ran some tests and everything. And they're like, no, I don't want you to worry or anything, but it looks like you might have something serious going on, blah, 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 blah. Don't go home and Google any of this stuff. And then sent me out. So, of course, I got home and started Googling things. So that whole night I was like, well, I'm going to die. This sucks.
WebMD has caused more panic than it's helped people. I'm sure of it. It's like, oh, my head hurts. Well, you either have brain cancer, a regular headache, or there's ants in your frontal lobe.
Right, exactly.
And so through that process, obviously, conventional and modern medicine plays a big role. But what I wanted to have you come in and talk about is the role that cannabis played in your recovery personally, and as well as, I mean, this is a very broad topic. I feel like in America today we have a lot larger acceptance for cannabis than it was when you and I were growing up.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I know some of the notions that people have about it are still out there and they're still incorrect. But I feel like we've made quite a few strides when it comes to putting the truth out there about cannabis, its benefits. Because I feel like the view today is a lot of people view medical cannabis a lot better than they did when it first came around.
Right.
Because I remember when medical cannabis was first introduced in a legal aspect, hearing a bunch of people boo it in a sense. And I didn't understand that because when you're in a severe medical condition, okay, they're giving you drugs that are much worse than cannabis. I mean, if you well, I mean, it's no secret that the overprescription of opioids is a massive, massive issue. So to be completely okay with, giving someone a script of 30 OxyContin and sending them home, but not being okay with them smoking a joint always seemed a little ludicrous to me. And I think that runs from the just long-standing prejudice.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, not anyone over 40, but the majority of suburban Americans over 40 still kind of have that 70s, 80s prohibition mindset about it.
Yeah, I think it mostly just comes down to misinformation, in my opinion, because, like you said, you still have these people, the older generation, spouting all this reefer madness propaganda. And I think that's part of why we've been able to make the progress that we have, because we as a generation, millennials, the Gen Zs and everything, grew up with the internet, the age of information. And so it's so easy to just go and Google something and find the information, go to Arrowhead, go to something that's reputable, and be able to get actual facts rather than base your opinions on this propaganda that's out there from people that are just in it to make the extra money. Because that's what it came down to in everything else, because the pharmaceutical industry is so against losing all this money if medical marijuana was to be federally legal, because they can prescribe you a dozen different prescription pharmaceuticals for something that a flower can give you the same relief. And the difference that I have to explain to people in my job a lot is the way that it goes about it, because people, especially the older people, are really skeptical even about hemp and CBD, just because they don't want that sort of numbing effect that they expect from painkillers. But these cannabis-based options go with a much more homeopathic method rather than directly numbing your nervous system like an opioid would, or shutting down parts of your nervous system to help you sleep like Ambien would. CBD and THC actually work with receptors already built into your body and replicate the effects of endocannabinoids, which are compounds that your body naturally produces.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different take on medicine in the view of we're going to... Obviously, cannabis doesn't cure everything.
Right.
But there are many things it can be helpful for.
Exactly.
And I think that people getting those two things confused can be detrimental to the advocacy of it. I mean, is cannabis going to, cure your cancer? No. But can it help fight tumor growth? Yes, and that has been proven in laboratory studies. Can it help with your appetite, which you lose during chemotherapy? Absolutely. Can it help with the aches and the pains? And also something that's, in my opinion, just as important, if not even more important, which is your mood.
Exactly.
Because when you're going through an intensely stressful situation, your body reacts to the mental stresses that you place upon it. And if you can have something to lighten that translates almost directly to actual improvement within the patient.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I saw firsthand, because obviously I've been smoking marijuana since high school. So it's something I'm very familiar with and everything. So when I got my diagnosis, I was already gung-ho hopping on the weed train again, ready to just smoke normal marijuana. But after about a month or two, not having a job, just the only time I leave the house is to go to my chemo treatments and everything. And then the rest of the time I'm just sitting at home getting high the whole time to deal with these side effects. It got to a point where it was deteriorating deteriorating my mental health, just having to be stoned all the time just so I wasn't nauseous, achy, all that sort of stuff. And that's where the hemp came into play, because it can give you all that same relief from cannabis without that psychoactive effect. So in my opinion, as far as it really just it comes down to what you would be using it for, because the studies showed that any type of cannabis, hemp or marijuana, is going to be awesome for dealing with the side effects of chemotherapy, the neuropathy, the nausea, the fatigue, the appetite loss, all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to directly fighting the cancer, you need extremely high amounts of that 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD, just because the THC actually unlocks different receptors in your nervous system and allows the CBD to bind to those, thus making it more effective in anti-inflammatory, anti-cancerous, anti-tumorous effects. And so that's why in legal states you hear about cancer patients taking like thousands and thousands of milligrams of THC and CBD every day, just because the way that it's working is the THC is basically sending your body and those cancerous cells into a semi-dormant state. It's basically getting the cells so stoned that they shut down for a little bit. And then the CBD comes in while they're in that sort of stunned state and helps push back that tumorous growth.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew obviously that there was a deep level to this.
Right.
It's not just, oh, you smoke pot, you feel good, yada yada.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a true statement, but
Right.
But I didn't realize how deep it went when it came to that in the science. And that's another thing that I think a side effect of legalization, especially federally, could have, is right now it is much more difficult to study
Yes.
the effects of different cannabinoids on the human body. And we're going off either small studies or anecdotal evidence.
Right.
And the actual federal legalization of it, you know, it's a lot more than just, once again, man, it's so multifaceted.
Right,
Like, this is a
exactly.
deep industry. You know, there's the health effects of it. Then there's the environmental. Yes, thank
Yeah.
you. The environmental benefits that can come from growing hemp, as opposed to, you know, using hemp to replace paper waste, using hemp to
Right.
replace plastic waste.
Yeah, that's actually something I saw the other week. Lego apparently announced that by, I think it's 2025, all Lego products are going to be made with a hemp plastic, which hemp plastic is entirely biodegradable. So, and I think it's 8 months for it to degrade rather than the 100 years or so for normal plastics.
Oh, normal plastics are not going to degrade within our lifetime.
Right.
The water bottle you drank yesterday is going to be probably floating around in the ocean until your grandchildren's grandchildren.
Exactly.
But the ability to have biodegradable plastic would, because more so in my mind than fossil fuels, which do play a big part,
Right.
but more so than fossil fuels or actual energy production, I think one of the biggest polluters and biggest contributors to the degradation of the earth has been plastic.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult realm to enter because everything has it.
Right.
The food you eat is packaged in it. You know, these microphones have them in it. These cables have them in it. This chair has it in it. It's everywhere. And to remove all plastic, well, not only is it a pipe dream, but the technological setback of it makes it not something that's really possible. But to replace, I was going to say, to the general idea of just getting rid of all
Right.
plastic
Okay,
in
yeah.
general it's not going to happen.
Right.
But if you have the ability to replace that with hemp plastic, something of a biodegradable nature, you're removing literal tons of waste that would otherwise have been produced.
Yeah. And not to mention just the other environmental benefits to it. The fact that, one, it's phytoremediative, meaning that it actually pulls out everything that's in the soil that it's grown in. Like, they've been planting hemp for decades now at the Chernobyl sites to try and pull up all of that radioactive material out of the ground to make it usable land again. So it can help clean up soil. It produces the same amount of oxygen as an acre of trees in like a fraction of the time. I think it's 1/20th of the time for hemp as compared to lumber. It can be used to replace paper products. That can be used to make biofuel, the hemp plastics. It can replace cotton production, which is one of the biggest users of water and pesticides in North Carolina. It takes about a quarter of the water that cotton does, and it's 4 times stronger than cotton as far as fibers go.
Well, and I've also seen another one, and this one was wild to me, is hempcrete.
Yeah, that's something that they've been using in those bio homes and sort of stuff. And I'm hoping that it's going to become more mainstream because a new factory actually just recently opened up out west that's focusing entirely on making hempcrete.
Like the uses for this plant are absolutely mind-boggling. I cannot think of another substance on Earth that is as versatile and has as many uses. I mean, medical uses, recreational uses, environmental uses, construction uses, the clothing you wear, the fuel in your car, the plastic making up your dashboard, the home you come home to, can all be made of hemp.
Yep.
And I understand if we want to get into the history of the demonization of hemp and marijuana, even the name marijuana was a demonization of it. They wanted to make it sound more Mexican.
Exactly.
I mean, the plant itself is cannabis.
Right.
But the regulation and the way that it went away, both for 2 reasons, and I know you've probably done a lot of back work on this, but the 2 main reasons I see when I look around are 1, straight up racism, and 2, the paper industry.
Yep.
I forget the name of the gentleman. Remind me if you know it.
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah,
he was the big paper executive who basically funded the Reefer Madness campaign.
And his entire idea, and this is ludicrous to look back on, was the reason we need to get rid of marijuana is because it makes white women more likely to sleep with black men.
Yep. That was basically the whole gist of that movie.
Yeah.
It's going to turn white men into murdering rapists, and it turns white women into whores who sleep with Hispanic and black men.
Yeah, and I mean, in what, the 1920s?
Yeah,
30s?
20s or 30s.
That was, unthinkable to a certain degree to the American populace. Obviously, we've come a very long way since that time period. And then secondarily was, of course, the financial initiative to keep it out.
Yep.
Because, it's terrible to think of it this way, but it's a threat to many industries.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It's got to be, from just a financial perspective, we have to be careful about the implementation, as in phasing out old and building into the new to avoid strict economic repercussions from it. Because as much as I, as an idealist, dislike the idea of putting corporate profit over something that's better for the earth and people in general, the part of me that's a realist understands that that's going to have to happen for a time. Now, that is not forever.
Well, I mean, it's something that I face a similar dilemma, but it's not quite the same one, just because I'm entirely against the corporate participation in the cannabis industry. Like, I don't know if you saw, I think it was earlier this year, Marlboro's parent company, Altaria, invested $2 billion into the Canadian cannabis company Cronos. And I mean, we've been talking about that at my work since then. Like, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to buy a pack of Marlboro joints. Like, they've lied to the population for decades about tobacco and the dangers of tobacco and cigarettes. Like, who's to say they're not going to do the exact same thing to us with cannabis?
Oh, absolutely. If they can make their cannabis product physically addictive,
right?
Which cannabis by its very nature is not physically addictive.
Yes.
So if they can take away arguably one of the strongest good points about cannabis in order to drive their profit mill, we already know they will.
Yeah, 100%. And so that's why, while ideally, I don't believe in strict government regulation, I do see a necessity for it in these blossoming industries, both to keep the consumer and the small businesses safe from that corporate power coming in and just dominating, like you've seen in places like Florida, where they only gave out, I think, 20 licenses, and 18 of them were bought up by cannabis corporations from either out west or from Canada. Like, it's something that especially in the hemp industry, we're facing head on right now because the conservative legislators here in North Carolina are pushing for a full-on smokable hemp ban. So that means any of the hemp.
That, and that to me it just stinks of the same fear.
It is
of like, oh well, how do we know whether it's hemp or it's marijuana?
That's exactly what it is. The law enforcement lobbies are so strong here in North Carolina that they've dictated the entire conversation. They have put so much time and money and effort into this. They are trying to convince all of our legislators that there's no way to tell the difference between hemp and marijuana. They were even at one of the legislative sessions I listened in on. They were spouting straight reefer madness nonsense about hemp. One of them went up there and was saying that hemp is a gateway drug. Something that doesn't even get you high, has no psychoactive effects whatsoever, is a gateway drug. Like, first off, I don't know any time I've smoked a normal blunt and ever been like, you know what would go great with this blunt? Some crack. That would be awesome. Never thought that. Much less when I smoke hemp. When I smoke hemp, it's more, oh, my back's not achy. I'm not anxious. That's great. I'm going to go about my day now.
No, and so I have an interesting perspective on this. So some people know this, some people do not know this. I am in recovery from alcohol specifically and narcotics.
Right.
So I touch none of it.
Yeah.
But as someone who went down the quote-unquote gateway drug path, pot, I was fine with just smoking pot until I was told I wasn't allowed to smoke pot.
Right.
And then I went for the alternatives.
Exactly, and that's the issue, because once they put you in one of those drug classes or something, marijuana can stay in your system. The THC metabolites can be detected for up to a month, even longer for some people, and crack gets out of your system within 4 hours, cocaine out within 48, like
heroin's out within 3 days.
Exactly, it's ridiculous.
Buprenorphine can't be picked up on most tests.
Exactly, and that just brings it back to the whole view that our society has as far as drug use, where they see it as a criminal issue rather than a medical issue. Because I can't speak for everyone, but I know every time that when I was younger and I ever tried a new substance or a new drug, it was because I was dealing with anxiety or depression or some other shitty thing that I just didn't know how to deal with, didn't have the resources to deal with. And so I decided to just get high or get drunk about it. And it's something that people need to look at drug addiction much more like they do in Singapore, where they legalized or they decriminalized all drugs, and they have like clinics. I think Switzerland has the model that I like the best, where they actually have clinics where you can go and they'll give you a clean needle, a regular sized dose of heroin, any other heavy opioid or narcotic that you're using, and they will be there to monitor and make sure that you're safe, and they give you access to therapy, all these other options to try and help you get off of those more addictive substances.
Oh, absolutely. Switzerland has one of my favorite models, and it's either Switzerland or the Netherlands. I want to say it's Switzerland that actually went a step further with it. They created an entire social program where if you enter into it, you get government subsidized housing, you get a government assigned job, you wake up in the morning from your subsidized housing, you go to the clinic, you do your shot, you go to work, you come back home, you do your night shot, and you go to bed. And when they took out all the risk factors associated with hardcore drug use and dependency, because the reason a lot of people don't get out of it is because, well, it's hard. And it's especially difficult to pull your life together if you have no place to live, no source of income. You can't pay to go see a doctor. You can't pay to go to therapy. You can't even pay for treatment, especially in the monetized rehab world.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I was very fortunate. I went to a free program.
Right.
And it worked out wonderfully for me. But that was only because I was able to have access to a program. If I had not had access to a program, I wasn't going to pay for it.
Exactly.
I was in a situation where I actively knew that I had to do something about my consumption, but had no way to take any steps forward. And what would have happened with me, most likely, because I was an opiate user, is I would have just ended up dying.
Right.
And if you look at the life expectancy, for the demographic of white American male is the largest demographic of opiate user currently. The life expectancy is now dropped to 25 years old.
Yeah.
You are not if you beat 25, you've won the lottery in terms of, at the same time you've lost because you're still alive having to deal with it.
Right.
Which is a terrible way to look at it, but I mean, and to swing this back towards the conversation about hemp, for some people, marijuana and hemp have worked wonders as being a replacement or maintenance drug.
Exactly.
Now, that is not something I personally have an urge to take part of.
Right.
Because I've been sober almost 5 years. I know how things affect me. And for me, it is the chasing of the feeling.
Yeah.
So for me, there's no substitute substance.
Right.
And that is my issue, however. That has nothing to do with the people because people lead different routes to addiction.
Right.
There is a genetic component to it. There's a social component to it. And there's some people who just got unlucky. For me, I don't really know. It doesn't run in my family. I'm the only person in my family who has had it.
Right.
I had nothing happen to me as a young child that led me to that sort of behavior. The only thing is I had ADHD and depression.
Right.
And that taught me to cope with it in certain ways. And marijuana worked for quite some time until I was caught with it, at which point I would become so paranoid every time I smoked because I was now mentally associating marijuana with doing a bad thing.
Yep.
And that up until the moment I got sober, I still smoked weed. I just didn't enjoy it.
Right.
I had it didn't do what it did for me originally, and that wasn't through tolerance or anything. That was through a shift in mental state.
Right.
And by legalizing and removing the stigma, I've heard tons of stories of people in treatment who were like, yeah, I was fine with just smoking weed until I got in trouble with it, and then I had to switch to something else. The amount of people who went, yeah, I smoked pot, and then I had to stop smoking pot, and then I took up drinking, and then by the time I could start smoking pot again, I was addicted to alcohol.
Yep.
Because the difference is, though there is a mentally addictive component to cannabis, that's not saying much considering there's a mentally addictive component to everything.
Right.
Any and every single thing can become mentally addictive. That gambling doesn't cause, gambling isn't changing your body's chemistry, but it's extremely addictive from the mental aspect. That can be the same with shopping too much online, eating too much.
Right.
And then you switch over to these different substances that have a severe physical component. And especially what we're seeing with the opioid epidemic is I don't think people understand the physical component of it, because it's like, oh, well, why don't you just want to quit? Well, just quitting entails that you're going to spend the next 3 days to a week in the worst physical pain you've ever felt. You're going to vomit. You're not going to sleep. You're not going to eat. Your bones are going to feel like they want to crawl out of your body. You're going to be hot and cold at the same time. You're going to sweat profusely. No one wants to go through that.
Right.
And if the solution to going through that is, I just need $20. You're going to take $20, you're going to take a week of hell.
Right.
Most people are going to take $20. And cannabis has been useful in treatment of some of that. It's within the recovery communities, it's a very sticky point.
Right, I can see that.
Yeah, because there's some people who go, nope, nothing, pure abstinence, no substances. Of course, we still all consume nicotine and caffeine at an absolutely ridiculous rate, which is also a psychoactive chemical, just whatever, the okay
no
one.
big deal, yeah, exactly.
The okay one, they're both addictive, they're both worse for you than marijuana is. But at the same time, there are, marijuana maintenance is a program. It does work for some people. It doesn't work for others. But to rule it out entirely, I was originally a big stickler for the abstinence-only form of treatment, especially, concerning the topics of Suboxone or methadone.
Right.
And while I still think that it is preferable to not be on a maintenance substance, I also think it's preferable to be on a maintenance substance and functional and happy as opposed to being on the original substance.
Right.
My view has shifted to whatever allows you to live a happy and useful life
Right.
is the preferential way to go about it.
Yeah.
And that's for each person to decide upon their own.
Right. The way that I see it mostly, especially regarding hemp specifically, is that I'm with you definitely that I think personally the abstinence method as far as addiction goes, obviously this doesn't come from personal experience, just study and everything. I agree with you that that's generally going to be the best way to go. And so that's why when we have people come into our store telling us that they're trying to get off of opioids, I try to explain it to them more as using hemp as a bridge, not as a roadway to continue on for the rest of forever, but more as long as you're willing to take those first steps and do what you have to do to get through those first weeks of withdrawal, it can help you through that. It's more of a support rather than a continual thing, because you can take advantage of its anti-pain, anti-nausea, anti-inflammatory properties to help deal with those really severe side effects at first, and you don't get the intoxicating effects as you would from marijuana. So it's something that you can use more as a stepping stone on those hardest steps.
Mm-hmm. And I've just been overjoyed with seeing the progress that the CBD industry has made, because up until 5 or 6 years ago, it wasn't talked about.
No.
It wasn't talked about. I'm sure there was information, but there wasn't much readily available.
Right.
And the idea that you could, because I mean, in those days, it was like, all right, well, if you want something with more therapeutic effects, just smoke weaker weed. Mm-hmm. Go smoke mid.
Right.
And that was even something that was hard to find at a certain time because of the growth in the industry to make stronger and stronger and stronger products, and then the advent of oil and dabs and vaporizers becoming common.
Right.
Because when I was in high school, dude, I mean, if you had
we didn't have any of that.
Yeah, if you had a vaporizer, you were the man.
Right.
Because you had to shell out hard for it. Nowadays, you clap a pod onto, one of the sticks you buy in a store.
Yep.
There you are. And these different delivery methods. And another thing I've heard quite a bit about is the potentiation of CBD within edibles and the benefits that has for a lot of people.
So as far as my opinion on it is, edibles have a time and a place, but they're definitely not the most effective method, just because when it actually comes down to bioavailability, you really want mucosal absorption or inhalation. Because from my understanding, the research that I've done, edibles, you really only get about 4 to 20% bioavailability because you lose so much in your digestive tract. But when you have mucosal absorption under the tongue, you get up to 60%. Inhalation gives you up to 75%. And then the highest one, as unpleasant as it is suppositories at 85%. So if you want to stick your weed up your butt, that's the best way to do it.
No, I mean, and this is once again something I can make a joke about. It's like most people who have been in any sort of addiction situation very quickly learned about the bioavailability of boofing.
Fair enough.
Listen, man, it's 100% for powdered substances.
It works.
If it works, it's not stupid.
Right.
Well, I don't know if that applies in this case. But because, for example, so obviously my family has mellowed quite a bit in their view of these things, going through what they did with me.
Right.
And which is funny because the information that was brought to them, the understanding mellowed their views. And that, I think, the only reason I can think of that people would dislike, like, if it's not for you, it's not for you. That's one thing, and that's everyone's own personal choice. But would dislike a large scale availability is misinformation.
Exactly.
And I'm sure there's some people out there that are going to stick to their guns, marijuana's bad. Good people don't smoke marijuana.
It's okay. They'll all be dead soon.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. I mean, it's phasing out. It's the same as tattoos in the workplace or colored hair.
Right.
The people who don't like those things are not going to be around much longer, and hopefully they have not passed their misguided information to their progeny.
We can only hope.
Yeah, well, and that's the other thing is the information's out there.
Right.
It's out there for you to read. And you talked earlier about something that I want to touch on, which is Arrowid. Mm-hmm. For those of you who don't know what Arrowid is a database of user-generated experiences pertaining to literally every substance that can be used in a psychoactive manner. Psychoactive meaning causes a change in perception.
Gets you high.
Gets you high. And from a recovery standpoint, it also has so many beautiful harm reduction properties about it. Because I was a person that was intensely paranoid about the ingestion of any substance.
Right.
After a certain point in time. And if I got something new, I went and looked it up on there. And that probably saved me.
Oh, yeah.
Multiple times because, I know that the counter argument is, yeah, but you're telling people how to do drugs. Well, people are going to do drugs whether you tell them how to or not. I would prefer them to do it in a safe way. Know your dosages.
Right.
That's the biggest killer of people on accident. And that's not talking about full-blown addiction.
Yeah.
Like, when someone dies at a rave, it's generally not because they were a hardcore addict who was shooting up in the bathroom. It's because they were some kid who just wanted to have fun for the weekend and took something that they didn't know the dosage of.
Exactly. I mean, I'm sure you remember I was in like late high school when there was just all sorts of research chemicals all around Raleigh. It was every person that you saw, hey, I got number, letter. And that's when I found Arrowid because I like to think of myself as an intelligent drug user. Like, I'm not going to try something that I have no idea about. And so that's why I love Arrowid, because you can go and get actual facts about something and then go into their user database to see people's experiences with it before you go in and try something that you have no expectations of, no understanding what your dose would be, what's going to happen before you go and put yourself in a possibly dangerous situation.
Absolutely. No, I was very big into the 25 carbon and 2 carbon, 25C and the MBOME.
Yep.
And the 2 carbon, so 2CB, 2CI, 2CE. I did a massive amount of research chemicals.
Right, I feel you.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and say it. I mean, if you don't know me, if you do know me, you know this, and if not, now you do. And that's another thing, the idea of the intelligent drug user. And I'm really hoping that as society progresses, we break down the idea that drugs are purely for, weak people.
Right.
People who wish to escape. Because
exactly.
even as a person in recovery, even as someone who has not touched a psychoactive substance in almost 5 years, I'm still intensely grateful for my experiences with psychedelics.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Like, I really honestly don't prefer the terms psychedelic and hallucinogens just because I think entheogens is a way more accurate term because at least in my experience, because like you, I tried plenty of those research chemicals when they were around. I've tried mushrooms, LSD, the whole 9 yards, and those are some of the most spiritual and mind-expanding experiences of my lifetime. And I really think that we as a society, first, like you said, need to change our view of drugs in general, and then more look at what each type of drug does, because there's a huge difference, obviously, between marijuana and crack. There's also a huge difference between mushrooms and marijuana. There are certain things that, like I would say, disassociatives, opioids, narcotics, all of those are the kind of things that people are more likely to be using for an escape sort of thing. And those are the sort of people that are at risk of addiction, because once you develop a substance as your means of escape, it's really difficult to get out of that habit. But when you're like, first off, most psychedelics, a tolerance builds so quickly that you can't be a habitual user. Like a habitual LSD user isn't going to be getting anything out of it by the third or fourth day in a row that they've been taking it, unless they're taking like a half a sheet at once. And
absolutely heroic doses.
Right, exactly. Like things that most people would be terrified of trying. And those I think are an entirely different group of drugs per se, just because that's why I tried so many of the different ones, because each one gave a different perspective on the same thing. And I really think that's part of how I developed into the person I am today, because I was able to look at the world with all those different perspectives, not just from the single sober mind. I was able to think about things in weird and unexpected ways.
The irony of it is, when I did psychedelics, even when I was in active addiction, every single time I did psychedelics, it made me want to clean up my life.
Right.
Like it didn't last, but for the next day or two, I was like, all right, I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to work out. I'm going to be a better person. But what psychedelics did for me specifically is they allowed me to perceive a degree of empathy that I was otherwise lacking.
Yes.
And that's something that's lasted since those experiences and still translates into my everyday life. And it's something I'm incredibly grateful for.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, was it fun to see cool visuals and trippy colors and realize we're all one man and it's just atoms, man? Yeah, no, that was a good time. I'm not going to lie and say
Right.
it wasn't. But there have been truly beneficial things that have come into my life from psychoactive substances. I've also had some negative ones, but it happens.
And even I think even those negative experiences with psychedelics can teach you a lot of things. Like, that's actually why I ended up dropping out of that private college, because one day I ate a 1/4 ounce of mushrooms and I was sitting there tripping my balls off, having a bad old time with seeing Alex Gray paintings whenever I closed my eyes. And finally I was like, wait, let me think for a second. $24,000 a semester tuition. Teachers make $20,000 a year. This is not a good plan. I need something else. Obviously, I couldn't do any more math or come up with a real plan. But the next day, I figured some shit out.
Absolutely, dude. I really I'm sure you're aware of Hamilton Morris.
Yeah.
I really enjoy his thoughts and his opinions on narcotics and psychoactives as a whole.
Right.
The idea that there are technically no bad drugs, just bad usages of drugs. Every drug has its time and place for a certain level of use. And the only argument I'll maybe make against that is crack cocaine.
Right.
Just because...
Unless you're trying to oppress inner city communities.
Yes. Well, that...
CIA.
Thank you, CIA. You didn't lose that plane load over Chicago. That's a very real issue of what they did. But oh Lord, there are just so many paths we can go on with this.
Right.
But not only the psycho. I real quick before we get off psychedelics, I will get on my Joe Rogan soapbox for 5 seconds.
DMT.
Hey man, have you ever tried DMT?
So I've tried it a couple times, only blasted off per se once, just because I'm not one to go to a store and try and buy a meth pipe. So I always did the sandwich method, and that always has that varying efficacy. But yeah, it's definitely something that whenever I talk to people about psychedelics, I'm like, you definitely should try it at some point in your life, but you need to work your way up to it. Like, a lot of people that I've talked to are like, I want to try DMT. And I'm like, have you ever tripped before? And they're like, no. And I always tell them, you're going to lose your fucking mind if you try that. Like, the best way I describe it is mushrooms is like a nice hang glide ride. LSD is more of like being in an airplane. And then DMT is like having your testicles strapped onto a rocket ship and launched off to Mars.
Yeah, I've had 2 experiences with 5-ACO. 5-ACO DMT, it's the DMT that we're talking about when people talk about smoking DMT generally. There's 4-MeO DMT as well, which is closer to a synthetic psilocybin. But I had 2 experiences with 5-ACO. One time, literally nothing happened. And the second time, I had gotten it directly from the guy that cooked it.
Yeah.
And it had come out an hour before it ended up at my house. And I had an interesting experience with it. I didn't go quite far enough. I didn't have a coach and I didn't understand.
Right.
I reached a point where my conscious body left my physical body.
Yeah.
And I could see myself on my bed in my room with my two friends who were there with me. And as soon as my physical body started to like fall because it wasn't consciously being kept up,
Right.
my unconscious self zipped back into me to try and keep me from falling, and that kind of broke me out of it. And afterwards I was like, all right, that was interesting.
Right.
But it's one of those things that I feel like, especially if done with the proper respect,
Yeah,
I think that's
definitely.
very important. The shamanic aspect of some of these psychedelics and the benefit that you can get from the guidance of that.
Right. That's why I really want to try one of those ayahuasca retreats that they have down in South America, because DMT, I always felt like it was such a tease, even the times that I was able to break through, because it's so short lasting. You don't have the time to actually explore that new space and get an understanding for what's really going on. And especially the first couple times, you're so caught up in the breakdown of the ego. Like, that was what happened the first time that I fully was out of my conscious body. I literally watched as everything in the room around me entirely disassembled itself down to the molecular level. Like, the bed I was laying on came apart into its multiple pieces, and then the multiple pieces stripped apart, and I watched it do it all the way to the molecular level, and I felt that happen within myself. And I think that's one of those substances that really just tear down the self entirely and makes you realize that there's so much more out there to our single reality or our single consciousness.
Oh, absolutely. For me, the two strongest trip experiences I had, one was on 2CI, actually. And I ate a heroic dose of it. And I spent a solid 3 to 4 hours I was physically on my friend's couch, kind of curled up in the fetal position. Mm-hmm. Mentally, I was a small blue fetus inside of a clear ball, just sifting through outer space.
Right.
And when I was in that state with my eyes closed, there was no differential that, no, I'm actually in the real world. Mm-hmm. And the second time was, I don't know, either a large dose of mushrooms I took. I never left myself, but that was some of the most strangely intense visuals I ever saw. Go.
Okay, so mushrooms has given me one of the craziest experiences that changed my whole view on the, like, higher existence, if you will, sort of reality. There was one time, I can't even remember how many I took a heroic dose of mushrooms, and this was when I was living up in Mars Hill, and we're right by the Tennessee border. So it was a thing that we would do is, if one of our group was tripping, someone else would get them in the car, roll up a blunt, and we would cruise the highway into Tennessee and back, look at all the mountains and everything. It was a rad time. There was one time that I took the mushrooms and my buddy was driving me. There was a moment that, like, a ringing started in my ear. We were about halfway there to Tennessee, and the ringing just got louder and louder. And then I had this really weird, like, it was a closed eye visual, but it was like my vision had cut out, even though my eyes were open. And it was like I was laying down and there was just figures standing over top of me looking down. And I tried to sit up, and then I felt pressure push me back down, and then I was back in my body. But there was like green pulsing on the edge of my vision. And for about 5 minutes there, it was like the thoughts that I was having didn't feel like they were my own. It was like someone from an outside perspective was looking in and having thoughts like, oh, look at him, he's tripping again. Here comes that car that's about to sideswipe us. And a car came up on our side, almost hit us as it changed lanes and shit. And then the voice was like, oh, Kenzie's about to drop the blunt into your lap. And he like tried to pass it and it fell into my lap. And it was just really weird shit like that for about 10 minutes or so. And then it just sort of faded away. And it was one of those things that I could never really entirely reckon with. And since then, when I've done really large doses of psychedelics, if I close my eyes to have closed eye visuals, I'll see different figures like standing over, looking down. And so it makes me real paranoid about the Matrix. I don't like it.
No, I do like the theory that DMT is an alien technology, but I don't know how much I buy into it. But
What about that mushrooms is like an alien spore that's infected the human race? Because a lot of people theorize that that's how we evolved, is that monkeys actually ate mushrooms and developed consciousness that way.
That's a wild one.
And also they found a huge colony of Amanita muscaria on the mountain that they think Moses went up to.
Oh yeah, and the other idea that the acacia tree, which is rich in DMT, was the burning bush.
Yep.
I know that there are some scientists who have come out and said, no, that's not how that would work. You wouldn't be able to, but it's a fun theory.
Right.
And this gets entirely back into the idea. So for anyone who just spent the last 10 minutes hearing us talk drug stories, well, what's the idea you have behind it? Well, you know, two guys sitting down talking about all the times they got really super high. You're like, oh, well, this is a bunch of burnouts. And it's like, no, not really. You have the ability to be a successful recreational drug user. You know, you're an advocate. You know, you work in an industry that you're passionate about. I'm a small business owner. Like, you know, you guys obviously can't see him because we don't have a camera, but our wonderful sound guy, Joe, who's here in the background, is, you know, a musician and one of the most, when it comes to audio technology, one of the better sources I've ever had. We've all had these experiences and yet are all completely functional as people, and I would argue in some cases better for it.
Steve Jobs did a lot of acid.
Steve Jobs did do a lot of acid. My favorite one is pointing out to people that Bill Wilson, the guy who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, was in a 1960s acid experiment.
I love it.
Yeah, they don't like that one. They're not. Well, no, Bill did acid.
That's how he found God.
No, he found God because his mind broke, but...
From the acid.
No, well...
How much did he do?
How much did you do, Bill?
Right? He probably didn't use Arrowhead.
No, he probably did that government shit.
Right, exactly. That's one thing. Like, now that they're opening up psychedelic research, how do you sign up for those trials? Like, that's something I've wanted to do. Like, I'll do acid for science.
Yeah, just keep the lab coats away and give me a fluffy blanket.
Right, exactly. Just set up a nice room, light some candles, give me some, like, Pink Floyd music or something. Like, I'll have a good time.
Yeah. No, and... Oh, man. It's such a cool realm, and I feel bad because there's so many people that will never experience it. Mm-hmm. But it also does, when we talk about the human ego, there's two sides to this. There are the people, and I feel like this is just a personality trait, who do mass psychedelics, and that becomes their whole personality.
Right.
And that is, I mean, you do you, whatever.
Right.
But at the same time, there are also plenty of people who did mass psychedelics, and that's not their whole personality. They took it as a learning tool, as an experience. You know, they've used LSD to help people cope with terminal illness, to help them cope with their own death. Mm-hmm. They've been using MDMA to help soldiers with PTSD, and it's had incredible effects in a therapeutic environment. Yeah. With a counselor there talking them through it. They've been using ketamine as a treatment for depression, and it's been working. There's just...
I mean, have you ever heard of, what is it, Ibogaine?
Dang it, you beat me to it. That was literally my next sentence. Ibogaine is a psychedelic that has helped people get off opiates.
Mm-hmm. I've heard it's a really bad time, but also I imagine opioid addiction's a real bad time. So having a 2-day bad trip and being able to not deal with withdrawal for a week or two, I'd say it'd probably be worth it.
Oh, yeah, I'd be sold on that because I've read stories and statements of people who did Ibogaine or Iboga, and that fixed them. Yeah. It right there. It fixed them. They go back once every 5 years and revisit the trip again, and they're fine. They're normal functioning members of society. And that to me is just wild. Right. And then there's all the different, because once you start breaking it down, and this is a big thing with cannabis, you know, people are aware of THC. Most people are now aware of CBD. Marijuana or cannabis is not just THC and CBD.
There's over 120. Yeah. And that's just cannabinoids, not even counting the terpenes and other chemical groups that you have in there.
And each single one of those does something different and then does something different in conjunction with other ones.
Exactly.
And I feel like the modern day Rosetta Stone is going to be when someone finally maps all of them, their interactions and uses with each other, by themselves, and you can create a roadmap at that point of, all right, you have this condition, well, you need this that touches this receptor and this that touches this receptor and this that touches this receptor, and here you go, we have it whipped up for you in a nice sublingual liquid.
And the great thing is, I don't know if we're doing it yet, but we finally reached a point where we actually have the technology and the means to do that. Because up until now, the reason why we haven't been able to make that, obviously illegality is a huge hurdle to get over, but all those other cannabinoids occur in such low amounts. Like, you're lucky to get CBG in less than 0.006% dry weight, CBN even less, CBC probably even less than that, and it's just, that's why we haven't been able to get over those hurdles and actually figure out the efficacy and the uses of these other cannabinoids. But I do believe it's University of Berkeley, if I remember correctly, recently was able to genetically modify brewer's yeast like you would use to make beer at home and make it so that through that same chemical process, rather than creating alcohol, it can create either THC or CBD. So under that same theory, I don't know if they're doing it yet, but they could do that exact same thing for CBC, CBN, CBG, all these other cannabinoids, and then we would have them in amounts that we could actually study and build that roadmap.
No, and that would be just, especially with me, one of the things that I guess kind of tripped me out, not to be punny about it, but was when medical marijuana took off heavily in California and it started to filter its way back to this side of the country, the fact that they had different strains for different things.
Yeah.
Because to me, pot was pot.
Right.
You smoke it, you get high, some of it's better than others.
Right.
But the idea that a specific strain is good at things, because for the entire time that I smoked, I did not enjoy it.
Right.
Except for one strain, and that was the ever so wonderful Cannabis Cup winner Girl Scout cookie.
Oof. Yep.
Girl Scout cookie was the only strain of weed that removed my anxiety instead of adding to it.
Yeah.
And because I could consume it in a much more measurable dose thanks to the advancements in technology, it would allow me to do things like, even, when I'm in the midst of awful alcoholism, get up, clean, eat,
right,
maybe go try and work out, do something. And that was so, obviously it was not used to its fullest potential.
Right.
But the idea, it's not all the same.
No, not at all.
And it's such a wide field.
Yeah, and it's getting wider every day. That's what I realized working in the hemp store is like there's new products coming in every day, and each different type of product has such different applications. Like the topicals, I've seen people get so much relief from those for things like arthritis, psoriasis, all sorts of different localized issues. We even have something that's a fiber drink mix. So basically how it works is, I forget the actual name of the seed husk that it has in it, but it has some sort of husk in it that gels up. Basically, it's a natural gelatin. And so when you add that to water and drink it with the CBD in there, it'll expand and actually press the CBD against the sides of your stomach and your intestine as it goes through. So it gives so much relief to people with like Crohn's, IBS, those sort of digestive issues. The inhalants, people with like cramps, panic attacks, nausea, those are going to be really great for getting that immediate relief. And then people with chronic things like Lyme disease, cancer that's non-treatable, things like that, the daily use of the sublingual oils or the capsules makes it so that it can actually build up in their body to give them that ongoing relief that they need.
No, dude, it's an incredible field. I haven't done as much research into it as I would like to, mostly because I am not a person who will be a consumer.
Right.
So it kind of slips my radar. But like just average people Like the ability to bring the relief of this to just average people without some of the stigma behind it is wonderful, because there's so many people that could be getting relief from chronic conditions that they're being overprescribed pharmaceutical narcotics.
Yep.
That's ruining their lives, and they had this option the whole time.
Exactly. And it's something that I think the medical industry, if you will, is finally catching on to, because I know when I was undergoing my chemotherapy, I obviously brought up the fact that I was smoking marijuana and hemp throughout it, because if you're doing chemo, you're taking like 4 or 5 different super crazy drugs, so like they need to know what else is in your system. And the doctors would always get all weird and hush-hushy whenever I brought it up. And then the nurses would come up to me on the side, like while I was getting my IV or something, and be like, I think that's a good idea. You need to do your own research on it, that sort of thing. Because they're held by these associations like the Health Association, the insurance companies, all that sort of stuff are holding them hostage from actually talking to their patients and having these conversations, because even discussing medical marijuana in a state like North Carolina, a doctor could have their license pulled in a heartbeat. That's why so many of them are scared to even mention it or talk about it with their patients, because it's not worth the risk. And it's something that it made me overjoyed when I saw the other week that the DEA actually increased the amount of marijuana they want grown for federal research purposes, and they increased the amount of people licensed to do that research by, I think it was like 200% or something from 2017. So it's definitely something that we're finally moving in the right direction. And the biggest thing that we need to keep doing is just breaking down that stigma. We need to be educating people, especially the older generation, because they're the ones that get the most relief from it. Like, being old hurts, apparently. Even being a 20-something hurts. I can only imagine being this like 4 times as achy. Like, they're the ones that are going to see the most relief. At our store, our biggest demographic is women over 40. Like, it's something that we just have to keep educating the public on it and make sure people really know what's going on and don't buy into the propaganda about it.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons I do support more regulation of it is more so from a consumer protection standpoint. Because I remember when CBD first came out and it was an illegal gray area, you would go to all these vape shops and they'd have quote unquote CBD for sale, and then people started taking them and lab testing them, and they had all sorts of stuff in them, and sometimes it wasn't even CBD. I remember they had one they ran and they found that it was half Robitussin. Also, the recent debacle, which was the counterfeit CBD and THC vaporizer pods that were, not made by a real company, not made within a clean environment, probably didn't contain half the things they were sold as, and it did cause lung damage in people, and people jumped on it and went, look, vaping's terrible for you. It's like, well, yes, if you're vaping awful chemicals, it's terrible for you. If I put antifreeze in this, it's not going to be good for you.
Right.
It's you have to be somewhat careful, and because of it's the same thing we see every single time. There's some sort of prohibition on something. It doesn't matter what it is. A black market crops up around it, and it affects the consumer's health more than it does anything else, because the crime increases and the pain to the consumer increases. We saw the same thing with prohibition. People started going blind from gin that had been made using lead pipes. Right. Or home brews that were not properly processed and killed people. Yeah. Not to mention, Al Capone and the rise of organized crime in America, which we have the same thing today. With the
Mexican cartels, yeah.
Yeah, and we look at I was listening to a very interesting thing the other day, and I'll just go ahead and credit Joe Rogan for it being his podcast, but he had a gentleman on who was a park ranger in California and stumbled into these cartel grow ops. And something we don't realize is that nowadays a lot of the illegal marijuana that is manufactured and consumed comes from inside the United States, but not from United States citizens. Yeah. The cartel will find a giant open plot of land, plant their stuff there, and worse than that, they're using banned pesticides on it.
Right.
And these are pesticides that I don't remember the specific name of the one he mentioned, but it was so
Eagle 20, Eagle 40, Eagle some number. That's the biggest one that I've heard of being on
Maybe.
illegal marijuana.
But it was so potent in its application that if they had gone to a illegal grow and it had just been sprayed with it, they couldn't even uproot the plant. They couldn't touch it. And that's not even talking into the environmental damage, because that was that
Right.
guy's big thing is, they're diverting small streams. That's how he found it originally, is he found a dried up stream bed that had a protected species of fish in it, and went down the stream bed and found that it had been diverted to an illegal cannabis grow.
Yeah.
And then there's those chemicals leaching into the soil, leaching into the water.
Right.
And, well, what gets rid of a black market?
A legal market.
A legal market.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not hard.
This is, and you spoke recently about the DEA increasing funding, which is good, and I'm glad they did that. That might be the only good thing the DEA has done.
Ever.
I already felt that you were on the same page with that. I am a staunch opponent of the war on drugs, both from a, I guess, libertarian perspective, and I do not believe the government should tell people what they can and cannot do to a certain limit.
Right.
If what you put in your own body harms no one else but you, that's your own business.
Exactly.
Especially in the concept of cannabis, where it doesn't harm you.
Right.
But on top of that, just the militarization of America's police forces, the massive amount of money that we spend every single year on a war on drugs that is making absolutely no difference, that only increases gun crime, that only increases gang violence, that only hurts people who are seeking a legal cure to their ailments.
Oh, yeah.
And I understand why it's done. One is, at a certain point, you go in too far and you don't want to be the guy that has to back out.
Well,
Nope.
I think it's entirely a control thing. Like, it goes back to what Terrence McKenna would always say. LSD is not illegal because the government fears that you're going to be so high that you're going to think you're a bird and jump off a building. They're not trying to protect you. It's because psychedelics make you question everything around you. And I think it's the same thing with most other drugs. The government wants us to think a certain way, and they want us to be good little obedient worker folk. And when you're smoking weed, when you're doing psychedelics, when you're doing any sort of mind-altering substance, it's going to change the way that you think about things, and it's going to make you question what's actually going on around you. And especially with psychedelics, it's going to make you question the authority and all the lies that you've been told by that authority throughout your lifetime.
No, it's the same thing as like if you're a parent and you're talking to your children about drugs, why you should be honest with them.
Yeah.
Because if you tell them that pot is the devil's lettuce and they go and smoke and find out that it's not, which they will, now they're thinking, well, maybe they were lying to me about cocaine.
Yep.
Maybe they were lying to me about heroin.
Exactly.
I can't trust them now. And it's the same thing. It's like, oh, well, you lied to us about this. What else are you lying about?
Right.
And just also to get into not even the DEA in essence, but the large pharmaceutical companies and their role in the current opiate crisis in America.
So, you want to hear a fun story about the pharmaceutical industry in regards to the hemp industry right now?
Oh, by all means.
So the FDA currently is in the process of trying to figure out how they're going to go about regulating CBD and hemp products, whether or not they should regulate it as a pharmaceutical product, a holistic product, or a mixture of those two. And so I think it was last month or the month before they held public hearings on this. And a lady from GW Pharmaceuticals, the company that has the patent on Epidiolex, a pharmaceutical version of CBD, she was up there and gave a presentation about how 2 CBD gummies below the 0.3% THC legal limit would have more THC than a marijuana joint. Well, she said a marijuana cigarette. Talk about reefer madness right there. But
you out there smoking marijuana cigarettes?
Exactly.
At least she didn't call it a left-handed cigarette. That really would have brought us back to the 20s.
It only would have been better if she did the little that number while talking about it. But, and I ran the numbers on it because she said that a marijuana cigarette would have about 11 milligrams of THC, which means that, just guesstimate, I mean, I don't know about most people. My joints are on average about a gram or so. That would be about 1% THC, which that's definitely one above the legal limit. And two, that's some shitty ass weed, especially for these days where growers in legal states are pushing THC levels above the 30% mark. Like, just the amount of reefer madness and unscientific nonsense that the pharmaceutical company expects us to believe. They're going by the exact same playbook that they did 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Well, no, because it's about fear, because fear leads to control. If you are afraid of this product, but we have a product that you shouldn't be afraid of, well, there we go. We have the market. It's the same thing with OxyContin. I'm sure everyone knows this story at this point, but when OxyContin was originally marketed, it was marketed as a non-addictive opioid, which is a blatant falsehood. And I'm happy to see that people like Purdue Pharma are being held accountable, but not in the way that I think they should. Because to them, paying $500 million or even $500 billion is a drop in the bucket. I believe that the people who are responsible for that
eat the rich.
I believe that the people who are responsible for that should face prison.
Oh, yeah.
Because their actions have killed millions.
That's why, like, I say it jokingly sometimes, but I legitimately believe that we just need to do away with the ruling class, both in our country and worldwide, because we have it set up nowadays where the tiniest handful of people are profiting and succeeding off of the destruction of millions and millions of others. And my fiance doesn't like it when I go around saying we should eat the rich all the time, but I came up with a compromise that I saw online. We turn the rich into mulch and we use it as fertilizer. Because one, everyone likes wood chippers. Two, it's environmentally conscious. And three, it's still really intimidating for rich people.
See, and here's the thing when people say eat the rich. My personal views about the ruling class, because I am at heart, as a small business owner, a capitalist. That is how my business operates, and it is a philosophy that I believe, when implemented properly, is a good system. Now, note I said implemented properly, and we are not sitting in a proper implementation of capitalism. We haven't had a proper implementation of capitalism since the 60s. We've watched a steady decline in that. I believe it is in the same way as socialism. I believe they're both completely viable systems with representation and checks and balances.
Exactly.
Just as both those systems are completely usable in a society where it is checked and balanced, they are both also quickly become totalitarian systems in one way or another.
Right.
Where socialism slides into a totalitarian government rule, capitalism slides into what we have right now, which is an oligarchy.
Yeah.
And to believe we have otherwise, I think you're kind of fooling yourselves.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Because the issue is, okay, so our entire electoral system, okay, who represents the people? The politicians, supposedly. Okay, well, that works great until the companies buy the politicians. Because when the companies can buy the politicians, now the politicians no longer represent the people. The politicians represent the companies.
Exactly.
Which means the only people that get to become politicians are the ones that represent the companies. Which means for the last 20 years or so, I'll make a distinct argument that we haven't had politicians in office that represent the people, with a few outliers. Yep, you can say Bernie.
Bernie!
No, I mean this seriously. When the corporation runs the government, how do you expect to regulate the corporation?
Exactly. And that's the issue. Like, a lot of the debates going on nowadays, people don't realize that we're all arguing the same points, basically. Like, the biggest one that I see is people that are anarcho-capitalists or really hardcore libertarians. And the argument that the government's corrupt and that's why we need to get rid of the government, it's it's everything's corrupt. It's the government's corrupt because the corporations are corrupt. It all comes down to moral failures, in my opinion. It's because we have immoral people, and I'm of the belief that capitalism, at least the way that it's been implemented in our country, it rewards people for immoral behavior. It rewards you for stepping on other people to get yourself to the top. That's why the majority of these big corporate CEOs in our day and age are sociopaths. Like, they literally just don't have empathy for other people. And I think that's why capitalism has gotten such a bad name, because in our version of capitalism, there hasn't been those necessary checks and balances. We have it in our government, but not in our economy. And so that's the issue that we ran into.
I absolutely agree, because if you look at, and also the whole idea that socialism is a dirty word. First off, socialism and communism are two entirely separate systems. Secondarily, socialist policies are already in place in this country. So if you receive Medicaid, Medicare, unemployment,
You drive on the roads, you send your kids to school, you have a mailbox, you call the fire department.
all of these are technically socialist policies. People like to talk about the New Deal, FDR's big revitalization of the American economy. They screamed at him that he was a socialist when he wanted to put that into place. And you know what? It worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
And then what happened to it? The same thing that always happens in a bureaucratic system is it became fat and it became corrupt. Mm-hmm. The thing that boggles my mind, and this is my if I was president tomorrow speech, okay? I think I have a mild way to fix this that assumes the logical leap that I could ever hold an office.
If everybody at the debates would just start with that,
Yeah.
I feel like it would be a lot more believable.
Yeah. So first thing you do is one of the great libertarian maxims of all time. Audit the Fed.
Thank God.
Audit them. As a small business owner, and as any business owner listening to this who has been moderately successful will know, a business that is not audited regularly fails. Every single time. You need to know where your money's going. You need to understand what things are being spent on. Okay? That's how you figure out, what am I spending on that is worthwhile and what am I throwing money away at? Mm-hmm. So you audit the federal government, because I want to know why the United States Air Force spent $1 million on coffee cups. I know why. It's because they had $1 million left in their budget and they didn't want to come in under budget, because then their budget would be cut.
Yep.
We spend 16 times more on military defense spending in this country than the next closest country. And the next closest country is Russia.
Yep.
We spend 16 times more. We are a burgeoning military industrial complex.
I wouldn't even say burgeoning. We've been a military industrial complex since probably maybe even World War I. Like, I really think that, because I know in our lifetimes, we've never had a moment of peace. We've been at war in the Middle East for basically our entire lives. Before that, it was in the Gulf. It's something that I really think just runs our entire government, and that's why we have these endless wars, because without an endless war, there's not going to be a need for an endless supply of bullets, an endless supply of factories. Like, it's something that I think our economy was built on, and that's another one of the flaws of our version of capitalism, is that it's relying on the suffering of people to keep it going. And that plays into the war on drugs. It plays into the income inequality, everything that's going wrong in our economy right now.
Oh, without a doubt. And one of the things, the irony of us is, well, people then think, oh, well, you don't like the military's bad. I have nothing against the military. I have a deeply military family.
Right.
I have a lot of friends who are veterans or active duty, and I have nothing but respect for them.
Yeah.
Because they're not the ones making the decision. Your average foot soldier, heck, even your average one-star general is not the man behind this.
Exactly.
The company is what's behind this. Lockheed Martin, for example. A lot of these big defense contractors are who are behind this. So why do you stay at war? Well, because we need to sell them bombs. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to drop the bombs if they're not at war. I looked this up. The other morning in Syria, between the hours of about 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., we dropped $100 million in Predator missiles. We spent $100 million blowing shit up in 3 hours. Jeez. Now, just think about this. I do believe the military is a necessity. I don't see there any reason to get rid of it. Okay, that's ludicrous in my opinion. I don't think we're really at that much of an active threat, and I honestly think we could probably decrease a lot of our active threats if we stopped meddling in other countries' politics.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, but they hate us. Well, why do they hate us? Has it been because we've been occupying their country for 20 years, blowing up their fathers and grandfathers and grandfathers' grandfathers and wives and sons and livestock? Is that why they hate us? Because that might be why. Have you considered that if we stopped messing with them, they'd stop hating us?
Exactly.
For God's sake, we funded bin Laden.
We funded every single one of our biggest enemies in the Middle East. We funded bin Laden, we funded Al Qaeda, we funded ISIS. Like, it's all CIA training programs because the CIA goes in there, trains a group of rebels to fight against an oppressive regime so that they can install a democratic puppet that would serve U.S. interests. And then they're surprised when the people that just fought so hard to take control of their country are opposed to outside control of their country. Like, I don't get where their logic stands in that, and it's something that they've tried over and over and over. They've been trying it since the early 50s or so. That's what they did in Cuba. That's what they did with every single one of our national enemies.
And one of the other big arguments I hear against socialist policies is like, oh, well, the taxes. Well, here's the thing. You're already paying that much in taxes. The only difference is you're not getting anything back from it. As a small business owner, 40% of everything I make goes to the U.S. government, and I don't have health care. I can't pay to go to school. There's no subsidized income. There's no subsidized housing. We are a country that was founded because of one tax on tea, and we're content to pay a absolutely astronomical amount of taxes each year and get nothing from it. Almost all your money goes to the military.
Exactly.
Almost all your money goes to defense spending. So here's my plan. We spend 16 times more than Russia. Let's just cut it to 8 times. Let's not even go crazy about it. Let's just spend 8 times more than Russia. With all that money that you just saved, you can implement socialized medicine and still pay the doctors a wage that would not enter this weird thing that people think is going to happen where all the good doctors leave the country.
Right.
I mean, you say that, but there's good doctors in Europe and there's good doctors in Canada, and they're all doing fine, and they all love their socialized health care.
Our senators go to Canada to get procedures done.
Yeah.
Mitch McConnell did that earlier this year.
But nope, socialism's evil.
Nope.
Okay, there. You have socialized medicine. Insurance. Create a 2-tier system with it. You have one that is free insurance that covers basic needs. And you have the other, which is you allow for still paid insurance that maybe gives you a better deal. So people that can afford it can get a better deal, and people that can't afford it, guess what? They're still covered. Mm-hmm. College, at least don't make it for profit.
Right.
Do it for coverage of costs. Because colleges don't need to make that much of a profit. They already make a massive profit off their sports programs.
Oh, yeah.
All the money you guys need is coming off those sports programs, okay? Keep with that. Cool. Make money off football. I don't care. But let people go to college.
Exactly, especially because it's something that the public college issue is more a changing times issue. Like, in our parents' day and age, having a high school degree is all you needed to get a good job that could pay your bills, you could raise a family off of. Nowadays, everywhere you go expects some sort of college degree. And so why are we as a country not providing our citizens what they need to set themselves up right? That was the whole point of FDR's New Deal, was so that the American citizen could have everything that they need to have a prosperous life, to have that life, liberty, and happiness. And we've thrown all of that out the window in the name of the bottom line.
And I think just from a massive social perspective, what's happening is a distinct lack of empathy.
Yes.
Because who are you to be against people being happy and successful? That's the entire American dream, to be against people being happy and successful is to be un-American. And the irony is the people that fly the flag the highest and yell the loudest and profess to be the most American tend to be the ones who are against that sort of thing.
Right.
It's like, why? Are you better? Do you just believe that some people should suffer? Because if so, please allow me to discard your opinions.
I think that's exactly it, because you have entire generations of people raised on this idea of the American dream being you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and you make it work. But our generation in particular had that idea crushed, because in the same 2-year span, right as we're all getting to that age where we're finally aware of the world around us, able to make informed decisions, right in that like middle school, early high school sort of area, we had 9/11 and we had the recession. We had that groundbreaking attack that made it very clear to us that America is not the greatest for some reason. Someone is very upset with us. Not sure why at this age, but I know things are not good. And then we had the recession happen and we had to watch our parents struggle just to make ends meet, even though we grew up watching them work so hard. And then all of that was pulled out from under them. And so I think it's had very lasting effects, I think, on our generation. I think that's part of why mental illness and addiction and everything is so prominent in these younger generations, because we are so thrown off in this world. Everything that we were raised on just fell apart on us right as we finally started thinking we understood it.
Well, without a doubt. And here's one of the things is, this is why I am such a big fan of and a big advocate for the idea of making medicine more affordable, is if you don't want to do it from a empathetic perspective, if you still believe that addicts are just dirty scum and should stop, or that people with mental illness are just weak, then how about this? Do it from an economic perspective.
Right.
Do it from an economic perspective. If the market and the dollar and the bottom line is all you care about, then from an economic perspective, providing better medical care for this country would increase our GDP. Because do you know who's not working and producing? People with severe depression, drug addicts, people who die in the things that are related to this. You want to cut down gun violence? Guess what? In the war on drugs, number one, provide better mental health care for people, okay, and work with alcoholics, because the majority of violence in this country comes from gang-related gun violence, which is driven almost entirely by the war on drugs.
Yeah.
If you want to fix these problems, healthcare is the very first stone you have to step on.
Yeah.
You know?
And I really think Marianne Williamson, as much of a joke as I think she is, the one time that she got it 100% right is when she said that we have a sickness care program in our country. We don't have a health care program or a wellness care program. We only care once someone is actively sick. That's why we aren't providing for basic checkups, basic doctor visits, because so many of these things could have been prevented. If I was able to go to the doctor regularly throughout my college experience, they probably would have caught my cancer long before it got to stage 3. But it's one of those things that I was working at a fast food restaurant. I couldn't even afford, even though I was so lucky to still be on my mom's insurance, I couldn't afford co-pays. I couldn't afford prescriptions. That's why even with insurance in this country, the impoverished can't get adequate health care.
No, they can't. And it exacerbates the problem. It makes it worse. Mm-hmm. Because then, okay, so I can't afford health care. Okay, I can't afford my medication. How do I get my medication? Well, crime's always an opportunity. Right. So therefore, in not providing health care for people, you are encouraging criminal activity. On top of that, mental health. In not providing for people who have mental health issues, you're removing useful workers from the workforce, if we're looking at it from a purely economic perspective and not an empathetic perspective. The empathetic perspective is they're fucking people.
Yeah.
They're people.
That's really what it just comes down to. And the people on the other side, I don't get how they don't realize that. Like, first of all, like you said, when it comes down to an economic standpoint, we would save money doing a Medicare for all or something along those lines. Because I think Bernie's estimate for his plan was, what was it, $32 trillion or I forget exactly what it was. I think it was $32 trillion over a course of like 5 or 10 years. But with our current system, it would be about $48 trillion for that same period. Like, we're going to save money and just by taking it from you paying co-pays and deductibles and everything, switch it over to being paid for in your taxes. And people get all sorts of mad about it. Like, I'm not going to pay for someone else's healthcare. Like,
You already are.
Exactly. Like, what the fuck's your problem? I don't have a problem with paying an extra $50 on my taxes every year if that means that some kid in Arkansas can get his medication, if some old guy in Washington can get the cancer treatment that he needs. Like, it's I thought that Americans are supposed to be in a united sort of thing, but now more than ever we are so divided and we don't care about each other, and that's where so many of the problems in our society is stemming from.
Oh, no, the absolute divide of the two-party system, which, by the way, if any of you read the works of the Founding Fathers, they warned us against this.
Don't do it. Specifically, don't do this.
Yeah, they're like, I imagine if they brought George Washington back, other than the fact that he'd be absolutely floored by cars and cell phones, would be the idea of like, hey, you know that one thing we specifically told you not to do that you did? How's that working out for you? Is that going well? Because the two-party system, a lot of the disagreements that Americans have in general is just tribalistic party politics that you agree with because you're part of a certain tribe.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, both parties are roughly the same.
Exactly.
Neither of them are really working for the good of the American people. Mm-hmm. Okay? Neither of them care that deeply for the average person.
Yeah.
They don't. And this idea that we're separated and fighting over such a thin margin of things we disagree on, especially when my philosophy on it is like, don't get me wrong, I'm pro-LGBT, I'm pro-feminist, I'm pro-choice, I'm also pro-2A. But the idea that I've always had generally is, guess what? You don't like it? Just don't do it.
Right.
Just don't do it. You're an adult. You're all adults. Every single one of you is a grown human being. And the idea that we can't have any cake unless it's all the cake you want is so childish. You disagree with it on a fundamental level. I don't mind. Voice to people that you disagree with it on a fundamental level. That is your right. I don't have to agree with you, but that is your right. But the idea of like, well, no, we can't have any of this because I don't like it. What? Who?
Right? Like,
who gave you this? Who gave you this power of life and death? Who are you?
I think it's something that's really pervasive, I think, nowadays, and I'm not sure. It's one of those things that I really don't know where it comes from, all this entitlement. People like to point at millennials and say that it's all us, and even then they don't have explanations for why we're so entitled. And in my personal experience working in retail, it's definitely the older folks that are more entitled. I've never had a young person pop off on me when their coupons expired or something like that. And I guess it comes from, in my opinion, it probably just boils back down to that American dream idea, because the people that still believe in it and think it's alive think that they're the best just because they're American. They're from here. They are the greatest generation on earth. Like
nationalism.
Right, exactly.
It might be nationalism that smells like apple pie, but it's still nationalism.
Right.
Obviously, we could go for 10, 15 hours tackling the massive amount of problems in the United States, okay? We have a lot of them. That doesn't make us a bad country.
Right.
And it's not un-American to critique what's going on in your country. In fact, it is the most American right to critique what is going on in your country. Our entire First Amendment is there, not so that you can post shitty memes on Facebook. It is there so that you can critique your government, and I think you should.
Yeah.
You absolutely should, you know?
It's what blows my mind the most. Like, that's where I see a huge amount of cognitive dissonance on the right side, because you have the same people telling liberals and leftists if they don't like the president to get out of the country, but then those same people turn around and want to talk about how people should leave, like the Squad in the House, saying that they should go back to their countries just because they don't agree with their vision of America. That's the biggest issue that I see on the conservative side of things, is the amount of cognitive dissonance and hypocrisy is just astounding. And don't get me wrong, I see it on the left as well. Like, it's one of those things that's very prominent, but the conservatives just do it to a level that I can't believe sometimes, especially with the current president. Just like, I mean, obviously I don't like him. I can see why some people might, and how some of his economic policies have had slight positive impacts. But overall, for me, what it boils down to is, once again, a moral issue. It doesn't matter how much he does for the economy if he's putting down minorities, women, and these other groups of people just for the shits and giggles of it. Like, by being a Trump supporter in this day and age, either you are openly and blatantly racist, misogynistic, sexist, any of those other ists, or you think that it is totally cool to turn a blind eye to it. And in today's day and society, I just think that is apprehensible. It's not anything that should be allowed in any form. And that's where a lot of the issue comes from with Antifa, is that they have taken that same outlook to the right side of the aisle as a whole, seeing it all as fascism, and that you have to stop fascism to protect these endangered minorities and people that don't have the same privilege as you might. And while I definitely don't agree with all of Antifa's methods, I definitely think that the fight against fascism needs to be something that we have a serious discussion as a company or a country about, because it's definitely on the rise. There are plenty of warning signs within this administration and previous administrations. Even Obama, with his uses of executive orders, drone strikes, all this sort of stuff, no oversight, it's just driving us even quicker down that road to fascism. And we as a country need to rise up against our politicians and show them that that's not the route that any of us, right or left, want to go.
I absolutely agree with you on that. I have my own disagreements with Antifa on certain issues, but the thing that I think people need to realize is it's not a structured organization.
Exactly. It's a mindset.
It's an ideal that a lot of different organizations have planted their banners underneath.
Right.
I know plenty of people who are affiliated with Antifa that aren't going out in the streets and hitting people with baseball bats because they disagree with them and setting people's cars on fire. I'm not one to advocate for violence.
Right.
I unfortunately feel that there will be a point in time where it becomes necessary, and I hope I'm wrong. But
right.
As someone who has I lived a very in the streets lifestyle for some years.
Yeah.
And I won't get into that, mostly because of statute of limitations. But I've seen the effects that violence have on people.
Right.
And also from talking to all of my friends who are veterans, that's true violence. Mm-hmm. They know what it looks like. And a lot of people at home do not know what it looks like.
Yeah.
And it's easy to call for it and incite it when there's something you don't like, especially when you're coming from the protection of behind a computer screen or a fake name. And it's easy to say, well, we need to do this and we need to do that. Well, here's the thing. You don't know what that looks like. You don't know the pain that causes, and it's not helpful. And I very much hope that we find a non-violent solution. And the irony of me saying that is, once again, I brought this up earlier, I'm a staunch proponent of the Second Amendment.
Right.
But at the same time, I own guns, okay?
Yeah.
I don't ever want to have to shoot somebody.
Exactly.
Ever. It is not something, and that worries me in some gun owners who joke about it, like, dude, I don't go to sleep hoping that someone breaks into my house and I have to shoot them.
Right.
That would be absolutely terrible. At the same time, I believe in the protecting and preservation of my own rights, and also I enjoy the sport elements of it. And something I've seen on the left that I am so overjoyed about is removal of gun ownership as a Republican-only issue, and organizations like Armed Equality is a really good one. The Pink Pistols, the Gun Owners of America, all these non-NRA organizations who are talking about arming minorities, people of color, the LGBT community, trans people especially, because they suffer some of the highest level of violence. And I think that the greatest thing we can do for them that not only helps to reduce violence, but also that puts them on a much more even playing field, especially in such a formidable time where you're looking at, we're looking at another side as enemies. I don't fall on left or right. At the same time, I don't really call myself a centrist. Because I don't believe in, do both parties have some good ideas? Yes. At the same time, the ever-present meme of the centrist standing in between a Nazi and an Antifa member and going, I can't tell the difference between these two. No, there's an obvious difference.
Exactly.
And that's,
I think it's more an overreaching effect that a lot of people understate that Senator Sanders' campaign in 2016 had, because at least for me personally and a lot of the people in my circles, we really didn't have an idea of the full political spectrum before that. We had the conservatives and the liberals, and that was all that we knew as far as American politics. There's an entire range further left than the liberals, and that's where you have the gun advocates and everything on the left side, because anarchists, socialists, communists, all of these people advocate for gun rights, for the minorities, for the workers, those sort of things. And I really think that Bernie just broke down the wall on that left side and allowed all of us to spill through. My favorite meme is that one where it's just a little snail with a Bernie logo on it going across a road, and someone comes along and picks it up and is like, "Oh, let me help you, friend," and just drops him in the middle of
in the grass, and it's all the far left wing.
Exactly.
Like, where am I?
Yep, that's exactly what happened to me in 2016. I was like, wow, these are some great ideas. I started doing more research in it, and I was like, wow, we should overthrow everything.
To a degree, I believe that. And also getting back onto the idea of eat the rich. When we say eat the rich, we're not talking about the average guy that made $100,000 last year running his own company. We're not even talking about people that made a couple million.
We're talking about people that make millions in like an hour.
We're talking about specifically about 11 people. We know all their names and some of their home addresses. You look, and I'm saying this once again, as a business owner, there is no feasible way to make $1 billion without hurting someone else. It doesn't matter what product you came up with, okay? Because the people who came up with good products aren't making that much money.
No.
I like to think I have a good product.
Oh, yeah.
You know what? I don't ever see myself making $1 billion off of hot sauce. Tabasco doesn't make $1 billion off of hot sauce, and Tabasco owns the hot sauce industry for all intents and purposes. So I see nothing wrong with people making money. I feel like there's a disconnect in those ideals when we talk about that. There's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with making a lot of money. The question is, how did you make that money? Did you make that money because you came up with a product or a solution or a platform and you then worked for it or into it? Did you make money because you worked in a company and you climbed the ladder and you did a better job? Sure, fine. Good. I do not begrudge anybody the ability to make a living. However, did you make money because you stamped on those underneath you, because you skirted regulation, because you poisoned the environment, because you underpaid your workers, because you cut their benefits or health care? Did you make that money because you lied or cheated or in some cases outright stole? Because if so, you're the problem.
Exactly.
There's nothing wrong with having means. There's nothing wrong. Like, shit, dude, you want to go buy a boat? Buy a boat. I'll even say to a certain point, there is a few of you want to go buy a plane? Buy a plane. Whatever. However, if, you have so much money that you can't conceivably spend it, you have to ask yourself, how did this happen?
Exactly. That's where I see the biggest problem, is where you have these people just making so much money that they're just hoarding it like human dragons sitting on top of a pile of gold. That's where we end up with these issues in our economy, because we don't have enough money flowing in our economy, because you have these billionaires just pulling it all out of the system. And that's why you have so many people living in poverty, so many people homeless, so many people going hungry, because we have the means to house and feed every person in this country, some would even argue in the world. But all of it gets thrown away because there's not enough money to afford it all. There's more empty houses in America than we have homeless veterans, and some even argue than we have homeless people in general. We already have enough empty houses for them. They just can't afford them. So those houses sit there and stay empty, and no one uses them until someone scrounges up enough money to go ahead and buy it or rent it. And it's just the greed of other people using made up money to manipulate and control the rest of society.
No, that is absolutely what it is. And that starts to get into a really weird spot when it comes to discussing, well, what do you do about that?
Right.
I mean, I know the quick solution.
Eat the rich.
But, I don't really ever want to see armed revolution come to the streets. I'd rather us resolve it in a peaceful way.
Right.
Because, I'm stating the same point over again. People are not prepared for what is going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
If you have to do that. It didn't end well in the 1700s.
Yeah.
A lot of people died. And that's the 1700s.
Right.
Those were black powder muskets and maybe some cannons. Nowadays, it's going to go real poorly. The force multipliers are stacked against the average citizen. I have hope for change in this generation.
Right.
I do, because it's it goes back to the whole Roman axiom of good times make weak people make hard times make strong people.
Exactly.
And it's the cycle, Our parents,
they had good times.
They grew up in one of the greatest economies this country has ever seen. On the other side, my grandparents didn't.
Yeah.
And when I talk about social issues and I talk about economics and I talk about my worldview from my perspective, from what I've lived through, to my grandparents, even though they're 90 years old, they share a lot more in common with our view because they came up and, little farming families in the middle of nowhere. My grandmother and grandfather are quite well-to-do at this point in time. My grandfather retired from the military as a lieutenant colonel. Mm-hmm. Then did a tour in the Coast Guard, then got a doctorate. He worked, but I remember talking to my grandmother about it, and she's like, yeah, no, there were nights where your grandfather was working 3 jobs while being in the military. I was working, and we'd come home every night and have soup because that's what we could afford.
Yeah.
And as admirable as it is to see that pull yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality and see that they did that, why? Why let people suffer when there's no need?
Exactly.
There's no need. And here's the thing. If we implemented policies to improve people's quality of life, your paycheck's not going to notice a difference other than it might go up. You're not going to notice a difference in your daily life other than you're probably not going to worry about so much, and you might have more money at the end of the day. And if that is all that these people care about, if that is the language that we have to speak, then go with it. Way earlier in this, we talked about Switzerland and the policy they implemented to help reduce opiate use, and it did. But here's the thing. Switzerland is an incredibly conservative country. Mm-hmm. From a empathetic standpoint, from a social standpoint, no one was on board with giving heroin addicts free heroin and free housing. But from an economic perspective, it helped the economy.
Yeah.
Because I don't think people realize how much those people affect our economic bottom line and also affect our healthcare system, because I don't know any homeless alcoholics that pay their medical bills.
Right.
But I know a lot of them that end up in hospitals. Mm-hmm. Just right there, the average amount per year that someone who is homeless and addicted to a substance is going to cost the American taxpayer is trivial in comparison to what treatment would cost.
Exactly. It comes back to the fact that most Americans don't want to seek help until it's severe. just because of the cost of healthcare, and they only go to the doctor when there is no choice. They don't go when it could be a preventative visit. They go when it's a reactive visit.
And the idea that you should have to put yourself into debt to be healthy, or even worse, that you have to tie yourself to a job that continuously erodes your mental state and well-being in order to be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
I get that some people are very stuck in their ways. I get that they're going to have a hard time changing their opinions about stuff, but I don't get that lack of empathy.
Right. That's something that I don't know if I'll ever be able to understand that. And I don't know if it's nature or nurture for stuff like that, because like I said earlier, our country basically encourages people to be sociopaths. It encourages that lack of empathy to be successful in our capitalist society. And that's why I'm a socialist personally rather than a capitalist, just because in my personal viewpoint, I see capitalism, at least in the way that it's been implemented in our lifetime, as something that encourages that immorality. And socialism, by the definition of the workers owning the mean of productions, not the state being communism, it's something that each person has control of their own input and output into the system, which I think is one of the more libertarian views out there. And so that's why it's really mind-boggling to me when they throw around socialism like it's a dirty word, because it's literally calling for you control what you're doing in the system. You're controlling what you're getting out of it. To each person their need, from each person their capability. Like, it's so that young boy across the country can get his chemo treatment while you're having an extra good week at your shop or whatever. Like, it's something that we can all look out for each other, and that's going to be what moves us forward as a country and as a society. I'd be much more in favor if we could just tear down all borders and get rid of nations and just be people, but obviously in our lifetime it's really unlikely that something like that would happen. But I think that this moving towards a more unity mindset is really what we need to survive all the crises that we're facing: the climate crisis, cultural crisis, economic crisis. We have to work together, and that's the only way that we're going to be able to stop any of this.
I absolutely agree with you. But I'd like to end off on one final thought before we go to our sponsor for the podcast today, which is, despite your and my differences of opinion on some things, we are still able to sit across a table from one another and have a rational and reasonable discussion. And I think that that is something that every person should strive in their life to do. Because when you sit down with the people, and I mean, not you, obviously, but when you sit down with the people that have been vilified to you in your life and you have these conversations, you suddenly realize that we are all deeply similar.
Yeah.
And that these differences that we fight over constantly barely exist. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Sam, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah,
it's
thanks
been an
for having
absolute
me.
pleasure, man. Before you go, do you have anything you want to plug?
No, not particularly.
Not particularly. Vote Bernie.
Yeah, vote Bernie. Well, just vote in general. If you don't want to vote for Bernie, that's cool. Just vote for your morals, not this lesser of two evils bullshit.
Yeah, vote and smoke weed every day.
Hold up.
But anyway, all right. So very quickly, we'd like to thank the sponsor for the podcast today. The sponsor is, as it always is, Oak City Hot Sauce Company. Oak City Hot Sauce Company is a local Raleigh company that makes craft hot sauce. It is absolutely delicious, and it's also affordable. No $10 a bottle here. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, all under Oak City Hot Sauce Company. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a wonderful day, and until next time, be safe.